At 0500 hours on June 19th, 1944, First Lieutenant Richard Winters crouched behind a hedgerow near the village of Carentan, France, listening to the approaching German armour. His radio operator whispered that German reconnaissance had spotted their position approximately 300 paratroopers from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, scattered across a series of fields and small farm buildings. Intelligence suggested they faced elements of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, at least 1,400 combat-hardened troops with tank support. The Germans believed they'd caught an isolated American unit that could be quickly destroyed. What they couldn't know was that this apparent tactical disaster for the Americans was about to become one of the most decisive small unit actions of the Normandy campaign. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Winters had not planned to be in this position. 13 days after D-Day, the 506th should have been consolidated with the rest of the 101st Airborne Division. Instead, miscommunication during a counterattack against German forces at Carentan had left Winters' battalion separated from the main American lines. By dawn, German commanders had recognized the opportunity and moved quickly to encircle the paratroopers. What followed would demonstrate why the American airborne forces had already earned their reputation as some of the most lethal infantry in military history. The Americans were outnumbered nearly 5-1. Most carried only what they'd jumped with on D-Day M1 rifles, a few Browning automatic rifles, limited ammunition, and whatever they'd scavenged since landing. They had no artillery support, minimal medical supplies, and no clear route of retreat. Standard military doctrine dictated they should attempt to break out immediately before the encirclement could be completed. But Lieutenant Colonel Robert Strayer, the acting battalion commander, saw opportunity rather than disaster in their predicament. "The Germans think they've got us trapped," he told his company commanders during a hasty meeting in a damaged farmhouse. "They're concentrating their forces against what they perceive as an isolated, vulnerable target. But they're making a critical mistake. They're giving us exactly what we want, a chance to fix them in place, where their numerical advantage means nothing." Strayer spread a map across a wooden table, its surface illuminated by a single kerosene lamp. He outlined his plan. Rather than attempting to break out, they would establish a defensive perimeter, choosing terrain that would channel German attacks into predetermined kill zones. They would make the Germans pay in blood for every metre of ground, buying time for the 4th Infantry Division to respond from the south. "They think they're hunting us," Strayer concluded. "Let's make them understand that they've walked into our trap, not the other way around." Winters moved to establish defensive positions for Easy Company along a sunken farm road that offered natural cover against both small arms and armoured threats. He positioned his best machine gunners at the corners of the defensive square, where they could deliver interlocking fields of fire. Sergeant William Wild Bill Guarnere established a weapons squad in an abandoned stone barn that overlooked the most likely avenue of German advance. Lieutenant Harry Welsh positioned his platoon behind a series of irrigation ditches that offered concealment and protection. By 0630 hours, the German attack began with a probing action from the northeast, approximately a company of infantry, moving in extended formation across an open wheat field. Winters gave orders for his men to hold fire until the Germans were within 200 metres. The discipline shown by the paratroopers was remarkable. Not a single premature shot revealed their positions as the Germans advanced confidently across open ground. When the Germans reached the designated engagement line, Winters gave a single whistle blast. The coordinated American response was devastating. 6 Browning automatic rifles opened fire simultaneously, cutting down the lead elements of the German formation. M1 rifles targeted officers and radio operators. Within 90 seconds, nearly 40 Germans lay dead or wounded, and the remainder fell back in confusion. The German commander, Sturmbannführer Kurt Meyer, was not deterred by this initial setback. Meyer had earned his reputation on the Eastern Front, where he'd developed aggressive tactics against Soviet forces. At 33 years old, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, and was known for his personal courage and tactical acumen. The failed probe had revealed American positions, and Meyer quickly developed a plan to bring his superior numbers and firepower to bear. At 07:45 hours, German mortars began a systematic bombardment of the American perimeter. The 81mm shells fell with increasing accuracy as German forward observers adjusted fire. Simultaneously, the distinctive rumble of Panzer IV tanks could be heard approaching from 2 directions, a classic pincer movement designed to split the American defense. This was the moment when many units might have broken, but the paratroopers had trained for exactly this scenario. Sergeant John Martin had established a series of pre-registered target reference points during the lull after the initial skirmish. As German infantry began advancing behind their armour, Martin called in the coordinates to his machine gun teams. The result was precisely aimed fire that separated the German infantry from their tank support, a critical tactical success that left the panzers vulnerable to the Americans' limited anti-tank capabilities. Private John Eubanks, a former Tennessee farm boy who'd never left his home state before the war, demonstrated extraordinary courage by crawling forward with a borrowed bazooka. From a concealed position in a drainage ditch, he waited until the lead panzer was less than 30 meters away before firing. His first rocket hit the tank's tread, immobilizing it. His second shot, fired as German machine guns searched desperately for his position, struck near the turret ring. The resulting explosion sent the turret flying upward, killing the entire crew instantly. The disabled tank now blocked the narrow farm road, creating an obstacle that the following tanks had to maneuver around. This forced them into a boggy field where their mobility was severely restricted. 2 more panzers became stuck in the mud, creating stationary targets for the Americans' few remaining bazooka rounds. By 0900 hours, the first German assault had been repulsed with minimal American casualties. But Meyer was far from finished. He still had substantial forces available and ordered a second attack from a different direction, seeking to find a weak point in the American perimeter. The second German thrust came from the southwest, where First Lieutenant Thomas Meehan's Fox Company held a thinly defended line along a hedgerow. Recognizing the danger, Winters shifted his reserve a single platoon under Lieutenant Lynn Buck Compton to reinforce the threatened sector. Compton, a former baseball star at UCLA, had proven himself an innovative tactical leader since D-Day. Understanding that ammunition conservation was critical, Compton established what he called kill zones, areas where multiple weapons could concentrate fire on German forces that would be temporarily exposed as they crossed open ground. He positioned his 3 best marksmen in a triangular formation that allowed them to engage targets from multiple angles simultaneously. The German attack began with a feint, a small force that drew fire from American defenders, revealing their positions. The main assault force, nearly 300 men, then emerged from a tree line to the southwest, rushing forward in waves toward the American lines. What happened next would be studied in military academies for decades. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the paratroopers maintained fire discipline, targeting German officers and squad leaders first, then focusing on crew-served weapons. The effect was to decapitate the German command structure and eliminate their supporting firepower in the critical first minutes of the engagement. Sergeant Donald Malarkey, positioned in a shallow depression with a light machine gun, accounted for 27 confirmed kills in less than 4 minutes. Private Albert Blythe, who had frozen in combat during earlier engagements, found his courage and used his exceptional marksmanship to eliminate a German sniper who had been targeting American officers. By 1100 hours, the second German attack had collapsed, with catastrophic casualties. Nearly 150 Germans lay dead or wounded in the fields before the American positions. Meyer, stunned by the effectiveness of the American defense, ordered his forces to pull back and regroup. He requested artillery support from division headquarters, but communication difficulties delayed the response. This pause gave Winters crucial time to redistribute his dwindling ammunition supply and treat wounded men. Medic Eugene Rowe moved from position to position, administering morphine, applying pressure bandages, and organizing the evacuation of the seriously wounded to a makeshift aid station in a stone farmhouse at the center of the perimeter. The German artillery finally began falling at 1,300 hours, a sustained barrage that seemed designed to break the Americans' will to resist rather than cause physical casualties. The paratroopers, veterans of previous bombardments, had dug in effectively during the lull. Most shells exploded harmlessly, overhead or in empty fields. The few that found their targets caused minimal casualties. After 20 minutes of artillery preparation, Meyer launched his third and largest assault of the day. This time, he committed all his remaining forces in a coordinated attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Over 600 German infantry advanced behind smoke screens, supported by the remaining armour and heavy weapons. By any conventional military calculation, the Americans should have been overwhelmed, but conventional calculations failed to account for the exceptional leadership and fighting spirit of the American paratroopers. As the German forces approached the perimeter, they encountered an interlocking defensive system that channeled them into pre-registered kill zones. American fire was disciplined, accurate, and devastating. German units that managed to penetrate the outer defences found themselves caught in crossfire from positions they hadn't detected. The fighting reached its peak intensity around 1,430 hours, when a group of approximately 40 German soldiers breached the American lines between Dog and Easy companies. Lieutenant Ronald Spears, commanding a platoon in Dog Company, organized an immediate counterattack. What followed became part of airborne legend. Spears personally led a squad of just 7 men in a flanking maneuver that caught the Germans by surprise. The ferocity of their assault convinced the Germans they faced a much larger force. After a brief but intense firefight, 28 Germans were dead, and the remainder surrendered or fled. By 1600 hours, after nearly 12 hours of continuous combat, the German attacks had been decisively repulsed. Meyer, having lost over 400 men killed and nearly twice that number wounded, approximately 60% of his committed force, ordered a general withdrawal. The Americans had suffered 23 killed and 42 wounded, significant losses for a small unit, but at a remarkably low casualty rate, given the scale of the battle they'd just won. As dusk approached, American artillery began falling on the retreating German formations. The 4th Infantry Division, responding to urgent radio calls from Strayer, had pushed north and established contact with the beleaguered paratroopers. The encirclement was broken, but more importantly, the German forces that had been concentrated against the 506th were now in disorganized retreat, vulnerable to counterattack. The tactical significance of the action near Carentan went far beyond the immediate battlefield. The destruction of a substantial portion of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division removed a dangerous threat to the expanding American beachhead. More importantly, it demonstrated that even isolated American units could stand against and defeat numerically superior German forces through superior tactics, leadership, and fighting spirit. Meyer, who survived the war to become one of the most extensively interviewed German commanders, later wrote about the engagement. "We believed we had trapped an isolated American unit that would quickly collapse under concentrated pressure. What we did not understand was that these airborne troops possessed a fighting quality we had not encountered in the West. They turned our tactical advantage against us, drawing us into a battle of attrition where our superior numbers became a liability rather than an asset." For the men of the 506th, the battle near Carentan represented a turning point in their understanding of their own capabilities. Private David Webster, a Harvard-educated soldier who would later write eloquently about his war experiences, noted in his journal, "Today we learned something crucial, that being surrounded doesn't mean being defeated. It means having targets in every direction." Colonel Robert Sink, the regimental commander who arrived with relief forces, walked the battlefield the following morning. Surveying the hundreds of German dead and the relatively intact American positions, he reportedly remarked, "Gentlemen, this is how airborne infantry fights, not by avoiding encirclement, but by turning it to advantage." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The battle had lasting effects on both the tactical and strategic levels. For the Germans, it represented another nail in the coffin of their Normandy defense. The loss of experienced troops, particularly junior officers and NCOs, was irreplaceable at this stage of the war. For the Americans, it validated the concept of airborne forces as elite shock troops, capable of operating effectively even when cut off from conventional support. Richard Winters, who had taken effective command during much of the battle, received a battlefield promotion to captain and was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. His leadership during the engagement would be cited as a textbook example of small unit tactics for decades afterward. Several other participants received Silver Stars, and the unit as a whole was recognized with a Presidential Unit Citation. In the years following the war, as military historians analyzed the engagement, several key factors emerged to explain the extraordinary American success. First was the quality of junior leadership squad and platoon leaders, who could operate independently while maintaining coordination with the overall battle plan. Second was the superior training of the airborne forces, particularly in marksmanship and small unit tactics. Third was the innovative defensive scheme that turned apparent vulnerability into tactical advantage. Perhaps most significant was the psychological dimension. The Germans, accustomed to American units withdrawing when threatened with encirclement, were unprepared for the resolve and aggression displayed by the paratroopers. This miscalculation led them to commit forces piecemeal against prepared positions, resulting in disproportionate casualties. The battle near Carentan was not the largest engagement of the Normandy campaign, nor the most strategically decisive. But in many ways, it represented a microcosm of the changing nature of the war in the West, where German tactical superiority, long taken for granted, was increasingly matched and exceeded by American forces. For the men who fought there, the experience formed a bond that would last a lifetime. Annual reunions of Easy Company veterans always included remembrances of those two critical days in June 1944, when 300 paratroopers defied military convention and annihilated a force nearly 5 times their size. Their victory demonstrated that in warfare, numbers and equipment are often less decisive than courage, skill, and innovative leadership. The legacy of the battle extends beyond military history. It exemplifies qualities that transcend the battlefield: resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, the strength found in unity of purpose, and the capacity of well-led teams to achieve what seems impossible. These are lessons that remain relevant not only to military organizations, but to any group facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. As dawn broke on June 21st, the paratroopers finally received their first hot meal in nearly 2 weeks. Sitting among his men, Winters was already looking ahead to their next objective. The battle had changed them all. They were more confident, more cohesive, more certain of their abilities. They had discovered that sometimes what appears to be a desperate situation is actually an unprecedented opportunity. The Germans had intended to trap 300 paratroopers. Instead, they had delivered themselves into a killing zone where 1,400 of their soldiers were annihilated in 48 hours, a ratio of nearly 5-to-1 in favor of the defenders. The fields around Carentan would eventually return to peaceful cultivation, the scars of battle gradually erased by time. But the lessons learned there about leadership, about courage, about turning disadvantage to advantage would endure as long as men study the art of war. As the summer of 1944 progressed, the ripple effects of the paratroopers' stand near Carentan extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. What had begun as a tactical engagement of relatively modest scale had evolved into something far more significant, a psychological turning point that reverberated through both Allied and German command structures. Major General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne Division, recognized the strategic implications immediately. During a staff meeting at 7th Corps headquarters on June 23rd, he articulated what would become known as the Carentan doctrine, the principle that elite infantry, properly positioned and led, could negate superior enemy numbers by forcing them to attack on disadvantageous terms. For the German High Command, the debacle near Carentan represented more than just another tactical setback in Normandy. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, touring the front on June 25th, reportedly became visibly disturbed when shown intelligence reports detailing the disproportionate casualties suffered by the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division. According to his aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, Rommel studied the maps in silence before observing, "We are witnessing the emergence of a new American fighting spirit. They no longer retreat when encircled, they dig in and force us to bleed ourselves white trying to eliminate them." This realization prompted Rommel to re-evaluate the fundamental assumptions underlying German defensive strategy in Normandy. The traditional German approach, allowing Allied forces to advance until they could be encircled and destroyed by mobile reserves, now seemed dangerously flawed. If surrounded American units fought with the tenacity displayed at Carentan, encirclement operations would consume German reserves rather than destroying Allied forces. By early July, the strategic implications had become even more apparent. German forces in Normandy were increasingly reluctant to commit to encirclement operations against American airborne or infantry units. This hesitation created opportunities that American commanders were quick to exploit. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army, noted in his July 7th diary entry, "Our men have learned something vital, that being surrounded is not the same as being defeated. The Germans have learned this too, and their caution now works to our advantage." The paratroopers themselves carried forward lessons from Carentan that would serve them through subsequent operations. Captain Winters implemented a training program during July that formalized the defensive techniques that had proven so effective. The Winters defensive system, as it became informally known, emphasized interlocking fields of fire, the channeling of enemy forces into predetermined kill zones, and the tactical mobility of small reserve elements that could rapidly reinforce threatened sectors. Private George Lewes, a radio operator who had maintained critical communications throughout the battle, later reflected in a letter home, "Before Carentan, we thought being surrounded was the worst thing that could happen to us. Now we understand it's something we can use against them. When they think they've got us trapped, that's when we've got them exactly where we want them." The psychological transformation extended beyond tactics to the fundamental self-perception of American forces. Throughout 1942 and 43, a subtle but pervasive sense of German tactical superiority had influenced operations in North Africa and Italy. American units had often been cautious, reluctant to engage in situations where they might be outmaneuvered or encircled. The events near Carentan contributed to a profound shift in this mindset, a new confidence that manifested across the European theatre. General Dwight Eisenhower, visiting the Normandy front in late June, noted this change in his communications with the War Department. In a confidential assessment dated June 28, he wrote, "Our troops, particularly the airborne and infantry divisions that have seen heavy combat, now display a confidence in their tactical abilities that equals or exceeds that of their German counterparts. This psychological factor may prove as important as our material superiority in the coming campaign." As July progressed, the strategic focus shifted to Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead. But the tactical lessons from Carentan continued to influence operations. During planning sessions at First Army Headquarters, Bradley repeatedly emphasized what he called Carentan principle, the idea that apparent tactical disadvantages could be transformed into advantages through proper preparation and aggressive defense. For the men of the 506th, the immediate aftermath of Carentan brought both recognition and sobering reflection. The regiment received a Presidential Unit Citation, the first awarded to an American unit in the European theatre. Individual decorations included 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 27 Silver Stars, and 63 Bronze Stars. But these honours were tempered by the human cost. 23 dead and 42 wounded represented nearly 20% of the force that had held the perimeter. Captain Lewis Nixon, the intelligence officer who had identified the German formations during the battle, organized a memorial service on June 29th. Under a clearing sky, with distant artillery providing a somber backdrop, the surviving paratroopers gathered in a small Norman church that had somehow escaped the destruction around it. Lieutenant Chaplain Francis Sampson, who had been captured and escaped during the initial airborne drops, delivered a eulogy that many survivors would later describe as the most profound moment of their wartime experience. "These men did not die because they were trapped," Sampson said, his voice echoing in the ancient stone church. "They died, transforming a trap meant for them into a trap for their enemies. In doing so, they demonstrated something that extends beyond tactics or strategy. They showed that the human spirit, properly led and inspired, can turn the very circumstances meant to ensure defeat into the foundations of victory." The integration of replacements following Carentan revealed another dimension of the battle's impact. The new arrivals, many fresh from stateside training, encountered veterans who possessed a confidence and tactical sophistication that seemed almost supernatural. Private Edward Bocafogli, a replacement who joined Easy Company in early July, later wrote in his memoir, "These men weren't just soldiers, they were something else entirely. They talked about being surrounded like it was an advantage. They described tactics I'd never heard of in training. Most unsettling was their absolute certainty that they could defeat any German formation, regardless of size or equipment." This confidence would be tested again during Operation Market Garden in September 1944. When elements of the 101st were surrounded at Eindhoven, they implemented defensive principles developed after Carentan. Though the overall operation failed to achieve its objectives, the encircled American units inflicted disproportionate casualties on German forces and maintained their positions until relieved, another example of turning apparent disaster into tactical success. The German perspective on these developments reveals how profoundly the events near Carentan had affected their operational thinking. General Lieutenant Friedrich Dollmann, commanding 7th Army in Normandy, noted in a July 12th assessment to OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, American airborne and infantry units no longer behave according to predictable patterns when isolated. Encirclement operations that previously would have resulted in surrender or rapid destruction of enemy formations now encounter sustained, coordinated resistance that inflicts unacceptable casualties on our forces. This assessment led to a fundamental revision of German anti-airborne tactics. Prior to Carentan, German doctrine had emphasized rapid concentration of forces against airborne landings, seeking to destroy them before they could consolidate. The new approach, formalized in a directive issued on August 3rd, emphasized containment rather than immediate assault, a tacit acknowledgement that frontal attacks against prepared American positions had become prohibitively costly. By autumn 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward the German border, the lessons from Carentan had been incorporated into operational planning throughout the European theatre. When the 82nd Airborne Division was surrounded during the Hürtgen Forest campaign in November, they implemented defensive principles directly derived from the Carentan experience. Though they suffered significant casualties, they maintained their position for 14 days against repeated German assaults, eventually breaking out on their own terms rather than surrendering. The most dramatic validation of these principles came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. When the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded at Bastogne, the situation initially appeared desperate, but Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, drawing directly on the lessons from Carentan, recognized the opportunity presented by the encirclement. By forcing the Germans to attack prepared positions along predictable routes, he transformed a potential disaster into one of the most significant American victories of the war. McAuliffe's famous one-word response to the German surrender demand, "Nuts," captured the transformed American attitude toward encirclement. What once would have been seen as cause for capitulation was now recognized as a tactical advantage to be exploited. The successful defense of Bastogne, which contributed significantly to the failure of the German Ardennes offensive, represented the full maturation of principles first demonstrated at Carentan. For the individual paratroopers who had fought at Carentan, the experience continued to shape their understanding of both warfare and themselves long after the battle ended. Sergeant Carwood Lipton, who had coordinated the defensive fire from 3 separate positions during the heaviest fighting, reflected on this transformation during a post-war interview in 1972. Before Carentan, we were confident in our training, in our equipment, in our Carentan leadership. But there was still an unspoken question about how we would perform when everything went wrong, when we were outnumbered and surrounded. After Carentan, that question was answered forever. This psychological transformation extended far beyond military contexts. When these men returned to civilian life after the war, many found that the principles demonstrated at Carentan resilience under pressure, the ability to transform disadvantage into advantage, the importance of preparation and teamwork served them well in business, education, and community leadership. Richard Winters, who rose to command the battalion by war's end, became a successful businessman in Pennsylvania. He attributed his approach to commercial challenges directly to lessons learned near Carentan. In business, as in combat, he wrote in a 1983 letter to former comrades, "Apparent disadvantages often contain the seeds of unprecedented opportunity. The key is recognizing that what seems like a trap can become your greatest advantage if you maintain discipline and refuse to surrender to conventional thinking." The broader historical significance of Carentan continues to be reassessed by military historians. While initially viewed primarily as a tactical engagement of limited scope, more recent analysis has positioned it as a crucial inflection point in the psychological dimension of the European campaign. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, writing in the Journal of Military History in 2005, argued that the successful defense near Carentan represented a watershed moment in which American forces demonstrated not just material superiority, but a tactical and psychological maturity that neutralized traditional German advantages in battlefield maneuver. This reassessment is supported by German records that have become available since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Documents from OKW indicate that by late July 1944, German intelligence assessments had identified a significant change in American tactical behavior, specifically noting that isolated American units were displaying unprecedented resistance capability and tactical sophistication previously observed only among elite German formations. These assessments directly influenced German operational planning for the remainder of the war, particularly regarding the commitment of reserves against surrounded Allied forces. Perhaps the most poignant perspectives come from the civilians who witnessed the battle and its aftermath. Marie-Claire Dubois, a 20-year-old French woman who had remained in her family farm within sight of the American perimeter, recorded her observations in a diary later donated to the Carentan Historical Society. Her entry from June 20th reads, "The Americans do not behave like men who believe they are trapped. They move with purpose, dig their positions with precision, and display none of the panic one would expect. It is as though they have chosen to be here, as though they have somehow transformed their encirclement into an opportunity of their own making." This civilian observation captures something essential about the battle's significance. It represented not just a tactical victory, but a profound psychological transformation that would influence the remainder of the war. The men who held that perimeter for 48 hours against overwhelming odds demonstrated that the outcome of battle is determined not by objective circumstances alone, but by how those circumstances are perceived and exploited. In the decades following the war, as veterans' accounts became more widely available and classified records were opened, the full significance of what happened near Carentan has come into sharper focus. What emerges is not just a story of tactical innovation or physical courage, though both were present in abundance, but a deeper narrative about human potential and the capacity to transform apparent disaster into unprecedented opportunity. For contemporary military organizations, the lessons from Carentan remain relevant. The United States Army Special Forces qualification course includes a detailed case study of the battle, emphasizing how apparent tactical disadvantages can be transformed into advantages through innovative leadership and psychological resilience. Similar principles are taught at military academies worldwide, where the battle is presented not just as a historical curiosity, but as a timeless example of how mindset can fundamentally alter battlefield outcomes. The landscape around Carentan today bears few visible scars from those violent days in 1944. The hedgerows have regrown, the fields have returned to productive agriculture, and new buildings have replaced those destroyed in the fighting. Only small monuments and an occasional rusting piece of equipment provide physical testimony to what occurred there. But the intellectual and psychological legacy continues to influence military thinking and leadership philosophy far beyond the boundaries of that Norman farmland. In 2012, on the 68th anniversary of the battle, a reunion brought together 4 surviving American veterans and the son of a German officer who had participated in the fighting. In a small ceremony attended by local French citizens, they dedicated a modest stone marker near the center of what had been the American perimeter. The inscription, rendered in English, German, and French, reads simply, "On this ground, 300 stood against 1,400. In their resistance, they demonstrated that circumstance alone does not determine destiny. That sentiment that humans possess the capacity to transform circumstance through perception, preparation, and will represent the most enduring legacy of what happened near Carentan in those critical 48 hours. It reminds us that in warfare, as in all human endeavours, apparent limitations often contain unexpected opportunities, and that what appears to be a trap can become, through courage and innovation, the foundation of unprecedented success. The paratroopers who held that perimeter never viewed themselves as extraordinary men. Most came from ordinary backgrounds: farmers, factory workers, students, clerks, transformed by extraordinary circumstances and exceptional leadership. What they demonstrated near Carentan was not superhuman ability, but the remarkable potential that exists within ordinary humans when properly trained, led, and inspired. This may be the most important legacy of their stand, the reminder that apparent disaster can become, through perception and will, the catalyst for profound victory. As the morning sun rose on June 21, 1944, illuminating a battlefield littered with evidence of German defeat, the exhausted paratroopers did not yet understand the full significance of what they had accomplished. They knew only that they had survived, that they had held, that they had transformed what should have been their destruction into an unprecedented victory. The broader implications, the psychological shift that would influence the remainder of the war, the tactical principles that would save thousands of lives in subsequent battles, the leadership lessons that would resonate for generations, all these lay in the future. But in those quiet moments of sunrise, as they counted their surviving comrades and contemplated the hundreds of German dead surrounding their positions, they sensed that something profound had occurred, that they had demonstrated something essential, not just about warfare, but about human potential itself. That realization, more than the ground they held or the enemy they defeated, represents the true victory of Carentan. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.